I currently live, work, and play in the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe on the shores of the Kitchissippi, otherwise known to many people on Turtle Island as Ottawa. And I've lived there for 31 years now, so it's been interesting, but I've lived around the country as well. I'm also very pleased that the Chief Justice is here and that so many folks who are in the legal profession already are here. I'm really excited every time I have an opportunity to meet with those of you who are leading us into the future. I'm super excited. As you can tell, I'm getting kind of old, and so it's time for new people to be leading us into these areas. So if there's anything that I speak about that you're really super keen on, come see me, and I've got lots of material to help you decide where you want to work on this. I've also had the incredible privilege of being able to work since law school, and I didn't come here. I almost came here, but I went down the road, and because they had a clinic that I wanted to be part of at the time, and so I went to school at Dal. But ever since I left law school, I have had the profound privilege of being able to work at what I likely would have done volunteer-wise had I not chosen some of the areas that I've worked in since then. I was very pragmatic. I was a working class kid who decided that I went and got training to be a teacher because I didn't think I could afford to go right through to law school. Then I really liked teaching, so I freaked out and went right to law school and accumulated more debt, had to substitute, and then came out, and as my mom would, and my dear departed mom would say, she got all of that education, and then I think she became a social worker or something. So, you know, everything's relative. But I feel incredibly privileged. I wanted to talk, I've done a PowerPoint, and David, right?
Yes.
David, thank you, David. So David has assured me that it can be made available to you after, because I'm terrible at I'm a total techno-twit. And my daughter always says to me, don't try and tell jokes, and don't try and use technology, because you suck at it. She's the one who got me on TikToks, by the way. So they'll be available, and they have images that I think would be useful for you to look at, and if you want to come have a look at them afterwards, we can zip through them. I've also provided a package of material to the dean, who I understand is also the law librarian at the moment, acting. And so materials that we've developed from the office that we've also made available, including this, which is what I'm going to focus on, which is the injustices and miscarriages of justice experienced by 12 Indigenous women. And you also heard reference to the Senators Go to Jail report, which, you know, we tried to catch attention, and some people are kind of interested because, as I've often jokingly said, senators go to jail, not the way some people thought they should go, but we've been going to jails, mostly starting after the elimination, what was supposed to be the elimination of segregation and solitary confinement, which wasn't, was basically a renaming in 2019. And it was a number of my colleagues. Many people think it was just me who decided that, but it was a number of my colleagues who had been studying the issue, and we had been going into the prisons as part of a human rights study, which I've also provided for the law library for you, on the human rights of federally sentenced persons. And when the amendments that the Senate made to that bill didn't pass, a whole bunch of senators said, we have to start. If they're not going to, if they don't care what's happening, we have to continue to monitor it. So that's the context in which we do that. So what am I going to talk about? Well, when I was asked to come up with some ideas, I asked what the committee was interested in. And so given what you've already heard, the idea of looking at who overall is criminalized and imprisoned, and what can we do to try and turn that around at a moment where the more dispossessed, the more marginalized, the more the intersections of that marginalization occur, the more likely it is that you're going to be criminalized and imprisoned in this country. So who's in prison? If we go to, okay, I'm not going to.
Would you like to do that?
Yeah, you can go to the next one. Thank you. You can see, I suck at it. So as we've seen, when I first started doing this work, so I'm old, I've already told you, I graduated in '84, and we were then advocating for the building of more robust social, economic, and health systems in this country. When you know what's just happened in the past 3 years with the pandemic, and the exposure of just how much the cuts of the last 3 decades have impacted negatively so many people, you can imagine that if it was bad then, you can imagine what I think about it now. I think we have a huge task ahead of us to build. Some people would say rebuild. I'm not sure we've ever had the robust system that we dined out internationally on, but we need to build it, and we can build it. And it's why I've been making partnerships with people like the senators who are often involved in business issues. And many people said, why are you working on, things like tax havens, and why are you working on things like beneficial ownership in companies? And I said, good question, I'm just learning. But why I'm working on it is, and why I'm on the Finance Committee with one of your senators from this province, Senator Mockler, chairs that, is I want to be able to challenge folks when they say we can't afford these systems. I know we can, but more to the point, the people who are involved in those financial issues, Percy Down from PEI said to me, Kim, if we can solve the offshore tax haven issue, we can fund all those initiatives you want to fund. So that's why I'm working with them on those things. So who's in prison? Well, right now we know that the prisons are full of people who are poor. I learned that at Dow. You may think I must have been a slow learner because as a working class kid, maybe I should have figured that out before. But when I was at Dow, I was working in the youth justice area because I had done an independent research project on the Young Offenders Act, and it came into effect while I was in law school. And so those of you who know what it's like when new laws come along, many of the judges, the lawyers, the Crown prosecutors didn't know the law. I'd just been studying it, so I knew at least what was supposed to be happening in terms of the legal system. So I was on my feet almost every day, and what shocked me, even though it's where I came from, was that if it was white kids, they were predominantly poor kids, and they were almost all in the care of the state. And mostly it was the Black and the Indigenous kids who were in court. Virtually everybody else was being diverted, either at the point of contact with police or afterwards. And I know that you're all young, you all know that by the time you get here, there's virtually nobody in this room, and don't worry, I'm not going to ask anybody to be called out, there's virtually nobody in this room who hasn't done something for which they could have been criminalized. If it was known, if it was reported, if it was proceeded against, if there wasn't other interventions. And there may be some of you who did have that, who then had the benefit of a really good lawyer because you had supports in place, or you may not have. And I'm not in any way suggesting more people should be criminalized, but it's not accidental who gets criminalized and who ends up in the system. And so as I'm standing here today, what are the numbers? What are we talking about? What does that look like? Well, you know from probably media reports that as we're having this conversation today, 50% of the women serving federal sentences of 2 years or more, including in Nova Institution down the road, but if you go to Edmonton Institution, the prison for women in Edmonton, they're at 75% or more are Indigenous. If you go to provincial jails in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the North, 75 to 95% are Indigenous. And remember that 75% of them have not been found guilty of anything. Then if you go to the youth jails, and this one shocked even me. When I went and I was working on a sentencing of a young Indigenous woman a few years back, I looked at the stats. I wanted to know what the stats were. 95 to 100% of the young women in the prisons designated for young women and girls, they're Indigenous in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the North. Then you add on what's their histories. Almost all of them have been in the child welfare system. Almost, in the women that I know, because they're older as well, many of them have, and all of the ones involved in this report, have either been in residential school themselves or they're first generation survivors residential school. All of them have been in the child welfare system. All of them have histories of abuse. Many of them, if they got any support to deal with that abuse, it was usually in the form of medication to anesthetize themselves, not trauma-informed support or counseling or processing through the system. Almost all of them have been identified as having mental health issues. Anywhere, depending on who you ask in the system, so not Yahoo advocates like Kim Pate, but you ask people in the system. And in fact, I was sitting next to a psychiatrist on the way here on one of the flights today, and we were talking about the fact that at least 75% of the individuals designated in prisons designated for women and girls are identified as having mental health issues. And in many cases, the only interventions they have had, and then you think of the intersection with addiction issues, are interventions that to anesthetize themselves to that reality, not interventions to actually address the trauma, to allow them to move on with it. So when you have that history, and you know that's who's in our prisons, it really becomes not just vital, it becomes a crisis that the Supreme Court of Canada said it was a crisis in 1999. What is it now when that's our reality of who's in our prison systems? How do we actually address it? And that's why we came up with the title. So if we go on to slide 4, I think it is. Oh, actually, thank you for reminding me. So the other thing that I'll talk a bit more about in a few minutes is of the women who are, when I started working, I went from working with men, so I worked with young people, as you've heard, and then as they got older, and we all got older, I started working with them in the adult system. But there was a real diversion between who continued on into the adult system and who didn't, and it was disproportionately those who were identified as male. And so I worked with men. I actually left doing that work in large part because of the misogyny and the sexism of the system itself. Because I made myself work with the very men who were in and were considered some of the most, well, they were the most vilified, but they were also considered some of the most dangerous. So I made myself work with men who were convicted of sexual offenses because I wanted, those of you who know me, or a few of you know that part of the way that I try to do the work is I always come at it from the perspective of how would I want to be treated if I was the person in that position? And how would I want someone I care about to be treated? And so in order to do that, I also have to understand, how did they get there? How did someone end up in this position? So when I went in and started working with the men, it became very clear to me. At the same time, my former roommate from law school was actually working on the Mount Cashel inquiry. And some of you see heads nodding. So I guess from this region, more people would know about it than when I talk about it out west, perhaps. But so she was working on the Mount Cashel inquiry, and most of the men who had been victims of the priests and brothers were in jail for sex offenses. And we had a discussion, and I said, where are the girls? And I said, well, if they were in Mount Cashel, they had been identified as orphans, or usually, because at the time it was considered an orphanage. Where were the girls? Because if the boys were there, they must have had sisters. And to her credit, she went back and looked, and most of the young women, I say it was, I would characterize it as homophobia. The fact that boys were saying they had been raped by men was discredited, absolutely, but not to the same extent that young women saying they'd been raped by priests and brothers was being discredited. And virtually none of those young women were believed. No investigations were happening into the abuse that they had experienced as well in the convent, or in the orphanage that was run by the nuns, by nuns, by priests, and by brothers. And so it started me thinking about, okay, so who's in jail for sex offenses? And so when I met, sure enough, it was most predominantly racialized and poor men who were in prison for sex offenses. And I had gone to school, if this is not always popular, but I had gone to school at Dal, and one of the places you could work as an internship, everybody warned, do not go there. It was a cabinet minister's place, because it was known that cabinet minister routinely preyed upon, and we never used the term, I have to say. I hope now you would use the term. Nobody said, he's raped young women. They said, he bothers. He pesters, he bothers. We all knew what that meant. And so most of us, didn't go there. Heaven help the unfortunate young women who did go there, and we all know what happened. They got discredited as well. So I started working with men. And when I started working with the men, what I realized was those who were really working on trying to deal with the issues that brought them there in the first place, be accountable, take responsibility, work through the process, try and remedy what they've done, they became victims not just of other prisoners, but of the staff, including some of the outside people who were going in, who would say things like, you're making sissies out of these guys as you're trying to work through these issues. So the long and the short of why I left working with men and started working more exclusively and went to Elizabeth Fry was because it became very clear that trying to pull along that system meant we were fighting against everybody in the system, from the police to correctional authorities, prisoners themselves, to nonprofit groups, to lawyers, and to judges often. And so I thought, okay, let's see what we can do on the women's side. And then I was shocked because when I went to work with women, I was shocked by, one, what they were even criminalized for. I had never seen people plead guilty so quickly, take responsibility so immediately, and be held more accountable than their male counterparts, particularly if it was involved in a violent offense. 91% of the women, when I started doing the work, had histories of abuse, if they were Indigenous, 87% overall. Most of them in for violent offense. I've met one woman in more than 40 years who I would say, by her account, and I would agree with her, committed a predatory act of violence on her own, not acting in concert with someone else, usually someone who had first perpetrated violence against them, and did it in a predatory way, and that's it. That's one in 40-some years. Almost all of the women in for violent offenses, if not self-defense, and not all are self-defense, obviously. I shouldn't say obviously, but it's obvious to me not all are. But in most cases, they are responding to violence first perpetrated against them. But they're responding in ways that even they don't identify. And you heard about the Cusack sisters. Odelia and Narissa are 2 of the 12 in this report. Because the minister, they're identified by initials in here, but because the minister has agreed to look at the case, there's no ability for them to remain confidential or have their identity remain confidential. It will be public, and that's okay. In fact, if the minister agreed to review all of these women's cases, every single one of them has said that's fine. If they're agreeing to review our convictions, we don't mind our names being used, but we have precious little faith in the legal system to actually treat us fairly, and so they wouldn't even agree to meet with the folks from Justice initially. And why is that? Well, if we go to the next, I think this is pulling at this. So when did we start saying the mass incarceration or the over-incarceration or the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people is an issue? Well, in my first exposure to it came through the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991 when they did their report, and the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry that Murray Sinclair and others did in Manitoba. So that's when it first comes to light. Less than a year later, after it's tabled, and after 5 years of work, the federal government tables the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. You might think, what does that have to do with this? Well, that was the first piece of corrections legislation in this country that was aimed at being a piece of human rights legislation, aimed at reducing the mass incarceration of women, because they'd identified that was an issue. It was one of the fastest growing groups back then, and Indigenous people. And so they put in place measures that were supposed to be off-ramps out of the system. They also put in place a measure that we're trying to activate, one of the sections, to allow people with health issues to get out. At that time, they were talking about people with physical health issues as well as intellectual disabilities. As it's evolved, we've recognized that needs to also include mental health issues. So as time goes along, so that's 1992, the first healing lodge is opened for Indigenous people, and you think, that's a great idea, why not have a healing lodge? And I've often said the first time I went to the healing lodge after it opened, I honestly thought, okay, maybe there's a way to develop a prison that doesn't conform to what usually happens in a prison, that it becomes a model of power and control, that it actually becomes more restrictive than rehabilitative, that it actually can do something. Because the first time I went into that healing lodge when it opened, and it's on Niganit Reserve, which is in Cypress Hills, Saskatchewan, so near the border. It's equidistant from, for those of you who know the area, Regina, Saskatoon, and Calgary, near the Alberta border, near the US border. And the first time I went, they were having a round dance. And at that time, staff had no offices. The expectation was that staff, and most of the staff were Indigenous, and that they would interact with everybody in the prison. I still called it a prison, even though the Indigenous people were saying, you know, we want you to call it a healing lodge. Trish Montour, Sharon McIver were part of an advisory body, an oversight circle of Indigenous women. So you can imagine, those are pretty tough women. They were pretty clear what it had to do. But even they had, I was brand new in the job when it was being formed. And they said, we want you to help back off your organization, it was a Thrice Society, because we have to put in a maximum security unit. We're calling it a safe lodge. That was the euphemism basically for a max and segregation unit. We're putting a safe lodge in because it's the only way corrections will allow us to take maximum security women. And most of the Indigenous women are classified as maximum security. So we said, okay, you guys have been doing, I said, and the organization did as well. You guys know what's going on. You have to come and tell us why this is needed. To this day, they have never taken a maximum security woman, a woman classified as maximum security, but that lodge is still there, and it's used for isolation. Not surprising, during COVID, it was also used for medical isolation, and it's been used mostly to keep women when they're transferring them out of the prison. So that first visit, aside from the women I knew from the Prison for Women in Kingston, I could honestly say I couldn't tell you who was a community member, who was a staff member, or who was a prisoner. When I visited 6 weeks later, it had already changed. Why? I guess I'm supposed to be talking at you, so I'll wait. I'll tell you. So, because almost immediately, corrections started to impose an overlay. So it was an indigenized model of a prison called a healing lodge, but they put the overlay up. You have to follow all these rules, and even though you've got an Aboriginal women's advisory circle, you have to follow the rules of corrections. So within 6 weeks, it already resembled more a prison. And now, but in every way but in name, it is like any other, or most other, except that it's in a beautiful environment, a minimum security jail. And that's how it operates. And so the very women it was constructed for, most have never had access to it. So that's 1995. Also that year, they introduced, and in 1996, introduced Section 718(2)(e). I don't call them Gladue factors, because Jamie Gladue never got the benefit of those. Jamie Gladue was a 19-year-old who had been moved from Alberta to Nanaimo by her abusive partner, Reuben Beaver. She was pregnant with their second child. He'd beaten her to a pulp so many times, it was unbelievable. He moved her away from her father, who would try to protect her. Her father was a single dad, moved the younger siblings with him to Nanaimo so he could be near her. The night that Jamie stabbed him, he first beat her up, then went next door, broke in through the bedroom window where her sister was sleeping, raped her sister, came back, beat Jamie again, and when Jamie stabbed him, he was back trying to get into that unit where her sister was. Supreme Court of Canada, the facts that went to Supreme Court of Canada describe her as a jealous wife, upset because her common law husband was having an affair. Does that sound like the facts I told you? How do you get those facts skewed that way? You get those facts skewed that way through a prism of misogyny and racism and class bias that came to bear the minute the police were called. Jamie had been drinking, a number of others had been drinking. Every Indigenous witness was treated as a drunk. Every non-Indigenous, not even witness, but after the fact, person who was there was treated almost as an eyewitness. So that's why I don't refer to them as Gladue factors. Jamie didn't get the benefit, and the only way lawyers would agree to even appeal the decision and take it forward was to argue a fine point of law that 718(2)E, which had been introduced as a sentencing principle, was supposed to be about the use of restraint of incarceration, especially for Indigenous people, only applied to those on reserve. It happened to be the judge happened to say, well, 718(2)E doesn't apply because she doesn't live on reserve. That became the only point of appeal that people were comfortable taking forward. Now, those of you who are already practicing, those of you who are law students, understand why. It's much harder to tease out the attitudes that make it so that you are, you put blinders on around race, you put blinders on around the violence. But those of you who have worked in the area of violence against women know how quickly we disappear those experiences and try to find some other legal way to assist. So that happens. When that goes to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada says the over-incarceration is a crisis. So 1999, it's a crisis. Then we have IPLE, then we have the TRC, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. We have different bills to try and repeal mandatory minimums. And where are the numbers going? You'll see we didn't even count women separately until into the 2000s. We couldn't get the data. So we go from, when I'm starting doing this work, there were about 10% in the 80s, now to 50%, and overall 32%. So our attempts to introduce special circumstance courts, healing lodges, more sensitive assessment processes have actually, paradoxically, made it more comfortable for the system to put more Indigenous people in prison, particularly women. Why? Because we don't have the resources in the community, and a decision just made in this community was shocking to me, to see a vote for a new prison. I could tell you how many times, not so much here, but in St. John's, I've been in, and the horrific situation facing people, but the reality that even if you just started with the women and kids and say, let's develop community-based plans for these individuals. At the federal level, it costs a minimum of $200,000, I hate to use financial pieces, but $200,000 a year to incarcerate someone. When you're talking about maximum security and segregation, you're talking about $500,000 and up per year. When you know that 50% of the prison population in federal custody are Indigenous women, and you know that the majority of them in maximum security, you don't have to do much math to figure out you could invest those resources in community with a whole lot better results. Part of the reason the government would not move on Bill C-5, which was the bill that was just passed last fall, on mandatory minimum penalties, and part of why many of the organizations, we were having this discussion earlier, including the CBA, wouldn't move to it, is everybody said, oh no, if we touch murder, people think we look soft on crime. And then a whole bunch of people got really mad when I said, okay, so you're saying that if we lock up more and more Indigenous women, and when you know that 90% of the women who have children, their kids end up in the care of the state, as opposed to about 10% of men. Why? Because usually there's someone left behind who will take care of the kids when the men go to jail. Usually the women are the last ones left standing with those kids, and they're the sole supports. When you know that, then what you're actually advocating is a soft on crime approach, is to lock up more Indigenous women, more and more, and put more of their kids in care. Now show me the evidence that that is making us safer. Of course there is no evidence. Everybody in the system agrees that the lowest risk individuals to public safety are those, women, those often with negotiating poverty, mental health issues, addictions, and the like. But what we do know is they need resources in the community. And so when we talk about how do you decolonize, decarcerate, or decriminalize and decarcerate, what we're talking about is the sort of discussions I was having week before last with folks in Saskatchewan. There, you know what happened just a few months ago, the horrific stabbings, the Sanderson brothers. But you may not have also noticed that all the Indigenous leaders came out very clearly saying, if you want to address this, don't offer us more so-called law and order, don't offer us longer, more punitive sentences. Come and provide the self-governance, the resources that we have been demanding in community so that we can develop the supports from clean water, housing, food security, security in terms of, basic things like education, so that our young people are not at the greatest risk of ending up in the prison, the school, or the institution to prison pipeline that the trajectory they're currently on. And so that's some of what we're trying to do, both in the work that we're doing, but also in terms of the overall initiatives you heard of the guaranteed livable income. That's really, people know the work that we've done around prisons and that we're continuing to do, but really the work that I went to the Senate, when the group of Indigenous women in particular who came and said, we want to put your name forward, would you agree? Well, first, given what the government thought of what I say and do, I thought, not any chance in you-know-what that I'll ever end up there. But the things that I want to work on and am working on are things like creating that more, going back to what I said at the beginning, a more egalitarian, a more equitable, and a more just system, so that it's not just a legal system, that hopefully we can call it a criminal justice system again in the future, or I can call it a criminal justice system again in the future. So on the way, we're working on things like trying to get rid of mandatory minimum penalties, because we know that the injustices that women face in the system, and part of the reason we've encouraged a review of all 12 women's cases, is you see that trajectory. The ignoring of the violence, then the deputizing of women to protect themselves. I don't need to tell anybody here. How many of you still hear the messages? Be careful where you go, careful what you wear, who you're with. And if you're not, then somehow you're partially responsible for whatever happens to you. We don't issue the same sort of expectation. Oh, we're increasingly doing it, and that's thanks to you guys. But we don't issue the same expectation of men, and we should. Why aren't we setting up a system where we expect the modeling of behavior from everybody, not just some people, and so we can move into a different process. And so when we work on the issues of the Indigenous women, we're talking about issues that if we resolve the issues that are faced by Indigenous women, necessarily virtually every other issue will also be resolved. Because if you focus on where the resources have least been expended, human, social, and financial, then guess what? We'll also be working on the issues that will impact the generations to come, not just of Indigenous young people, but of all of us. And so really it's investing in those kinds of measures. So the materials that we're doing, and one of the things that sorry, I'm doing this to you as the dean, and you may say, forget it, I can't do this. But we've been, during the pandemic, we've been able to take on more and more law students and other students who are not necessarily able to come to Ottawa. We started doing it because I was teaching at Ottawa U when I was appointed. And one of the things that several law students from across the country have asked during the pandemic is whether they could come do internships. And the real benefit of that is all of these ideas about social media, about new ways of communicating, about linking into other sectors have come from young people. And in our office, everything I've already told you, my daughter got me to do TikTok. Another student who's now clerking with Justice Martin was the one who got us doing podcasts. Others have got us doing other forms of social media. As well, they've been really instrumental in bringing together different facets of the work we do. And I'd say to you, if you can see things that you think I should be doing, you're now part of the circle. I consider you part of the circle who holds me accountable. Not that it's your job to hold me accountable. I've got to do that myself as well. But part of the circle to help direct, because one of the roles of senators is to represent the interests of those who are intentionally ignored, either by the elected body or by the public. And so I consider those who because they're poor, have experienced economic deprivation, don't have access to the House of Commons or to even the Senate half the time, that's part of my responsibility. Working in alliance with Indigenous leaders is also part of the responsibility. And working to ensure there are opportunities for your generations and generations to come to inherit a different, both in terms of sustainable, but also sustainable in terms of environmental, but also sustainable in terms of human development is vitally important. So I am so excited to be here, and I think I'm over at my time limit, so I will stop there, and I will encourage you, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them. If as you can probably tell, I really value the interactive process, so I'm really excited about this next part of the discussion. And if any of you want copies of these reports or any of the work we're doing, law students have also worked with us and with some of the folks inside prisoners to develop information packages. If you want any of that, they're available in French and English in the library whenever they get put in there, and you can also get them all online, or you can email us if you prefer to have your own electronic version. And this David has kindly agreed to make available. So thank you.
To come and chat with her, and I'm sure she'd, in between maybe some bites of food, she'd love to answer some of your questions. So I just want to thank you once again for that talk, and I'm just going to fire away. Everybody knows who I am, I'm Professor Thompson, but did you know I used to be a Senate page? So I am extra qualified for this. Okay, I'll stop. Okay, first question. Over your career, you've been at the forefront of major issues facing prison law and the treatment of women within prisons, such as the Kingston Prison Review and the Self-Defense Review, among others. Has it been hard getting attention on these issues? And I expect attention from various camps, the media, government, the general population. And has it been harder getting reviews and recommendations actually implemented? So I guess that's a two-part question.
Well, the easy answer is yes and yes. So, but that's probably a bit of a cop-out. Yeah, I think when I first, well, let me back up a bit. I didn't ask all of you because I was supposed to be doing a lecture, but I'd be interested, how many of you, if I said prison abolition, know what I mean? Just stick up your hands. So when I first started doing this work, and if I had said that, how many people do you think would have stuck up their hands? Zero, exactly. And so that gives you some idea of how far things have moved. I think the ability to get information out, and not so much to get to prisons, but to get information out and to make sure people are aware of issues has increased. And as Emma Cunliffe at UBC has written, I think, as we're seeing more and more of you who are studying and researching and incredible writers, unlike me, doing this work, Emma Cunliffe did a great article that encourages judges to question the evidence they receive from police and correctional authorities. You wouldn't have seen that when I was at law school at all. If you were a prisoner, everything you said must be wrong, and nobody ever interrogated the fact that it's the people who create the records who are responsible for the state. A standard, those of you who know me, I'll often say, consider the source and who benefits from the perspective you're being asked to accept. And when you think that through, usually it's not the person. And during the P4W, the incidents that gave rise to the Arbor Commission, there were many times that I was challenged, and that's when the anecdote that Professor Frock talked about, that Karen talked about, came up, that they said, I was there all the time, I was interfering all the time, but I didn't really understand what was going on, and that I was usually conned by the women. And my response was, it's possible I was being conned, but why would that benefit them? Because if I'm just being conned, and then I advocate something that makes no sense, or is proven to be wrong, then who benefits from that? And so it's that kind of processing that really helped me think things through. And maybe because I had come from I didn't have training in criminology or any of those things, and so I didn't know the theories. I just knew what didn't make sense. if 8 women tell me they've been stripped and shackled by a male emergency response team, and then the whole management team and half the prison says it's false and it didn't happen, it's kind of weird that they'd say that in the first place. So in that situation, what saved us, I mean, we would never have had the Arbor Commission if it hadn't been videotaped. The Corrections was videotaping it for their own benefit, and when we got the videotapes out to CBC, I actually hadn't even seen them yet, but I thought there'd be nothing on them. I thought they would have erased them, because, and actually I'll say when we go to jail, sorry, after saying yes and yes, now I'm going on ad nauseum, but
Keep going.
when we did the Senators Go to Jail report, one of the things, actually Colin Deacon, Senator Deacon from Nova Scotia, keeps saying he wants to do surprise visits. And I keep saying to the senators, I don't want to do surprise visits, because I want you to see what they think is okay when they know we're coming. And the report we did, and the report that the Human Rights Committee did, is a chronicling of that. How often they break the law, violate their own policy, and either don't know that it's wrong or think they're entitled to do it. And so, we may someday do some, I'm not against doing surprise visits, but I want to keep taking senators when everybody knows we're coming, because senators, members of parliament, and judges have a right of access, so I'm trying to advocate we all go. As Louise Arbor said, if you're a police officer, a prosecutor, defense counsel, judge, or a legislator, and you don't know what the conditions of confinement are to which the people are coming before you or you're dealing with will be what they'll face, then you have no business doing that work. And I actually believe that. I think that's why we have senators now voting the way they do on legislation. It's not any magical thing that I'm doing. It's the fact that they're going in, meeting with prisoners, meeting with staff. It's not just, I get just as much information from staff as I do from prisoners half the time.
Let's circle back to the tapes though, because you never finished that. So when you sent the tapes to CBC, what happened?
I didn't send them.
Who sent? Oh, someone else did.
Someone else sent them.
Okay.
Yeah. So they got to CBC, and they wanted to film me watching them, and I didn't know what was on them. And so if you ever go back and watch Fifth Estate, I think it's back up in their archives. I'm watching it in that show. I'm watching them for the first time. And what shocked me most was everything the women told me was on the tapes except one incident. And the incident involves one of the women in the report, who was the longest serving Indigenous woman prisoner. And she described a baton being brought up between her legs when she was being held outside the cell, because what they did was they went in, took everybody out, stripped them naked, left them standing there, and took everything out of their cell and then put them back in the cell with just a paper gown. Sort of like if you go for x-rays or that sort of thing, the paper, I guess they're not using it to be environmental now, but what used to be the paper gowns, and they left them fully shackled. And that woman, when we watched the videotape, as it went along, it got to her and where she said it happened, where the baton was brought up, and the tape skipped 5 minutes, because they have a thing. And I'll go to my deathbed believing that's when that baton came up between her legs. Everything else the woman said, being denied heart medication, glasses being stomped on, being struck with batons, have clothes cut off, being slammed to the floor. That was all on the videotape.
So you've worked as an advocate in this field for most of your professional life. Now you're a senator. And has being in the Red Chamber, because it's a very different place, I don't think there's any place quite like it. It's not like being in the House of Commons. It's a very different environment. Has this changed your perception on how reform gets done in this area? And you've already been talking about the political will and the education of senators, but has your perspective changed at all since being appointed to the Senate?
Well, I think I'm meeting with and working with people I would never have imagined I'd ever work with or be involved with, and that's, it's really been helpful to make me figure out better ways to communicate issues. So for instance, people will say, you talk about decarceration, not prison abolition. Well, the reason I talk about decarceration is people hear it. When I say abolition, people close down. And so I'm prepared to live with my own hypocrisy in the moment. Everybody who knows me knows what I'm talking about. part of it is figuring out, okay, where do I meet, you know, the same issue I was talking about, actually, what you know, is how do I meet you where you are and encourage you to understand these issues. And so, and similarly, I'm trying to learn their worlds when it comes to how do we fund, because the big thing everybody's saying, especially coming out of the pandemic, you know, too bad Jacinda Ardern resigned, because she was probably one of the few international leaders not saying this, but everybody's saying, oh, we can't afford it. I'm thinking, we can't afford to continue doing what we were doing. You know, look at the mess that healthcare is in, right across this country. Part of the reason we had to have lockdowns, of course we had to physically distance, but part of the reason we needed lockdowns, remember the first argument? Let's not overstrain the healthcare system, because we weren't ready for a crisis. And so I think we need to go back and remind my counterparts in the House of Commons as well as in the Senate, like that's part of how we got to some of the crisis on this pandemic globally as well as in Canada. And so we have to shore up the supports. We can't leave some people with nothing. And we have, during this, you know, I keep reminding, I got really unpopular at one point voting against the budget, which we're not, as you know, as a Senate page, we're not allowed to do that. It's really bad. They got really mad. Everybody was mad at me. Even my friends were mad at me because they all wanted to go home for Christmas and the holidays. And yeah, you know what it's like.
Ages were probably mad too.
Yeah, they probably were. But anyway, so, but I was so upset. That was in 2020 because, you know, meanwhile I know people who are on the street who have been evicted in my very close circle, my family and friends, who are really struggling. And we've rolled out benefits for some. Corporations are making gazillions of dollars, pivoting and all that, you know, language. And meanwhile, 3.5 to 5 million people in this country got no support, zero support, health, financial, anything. And you know, it's like we weren't paying attention to those people. And so I've, you know, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we communicate that. And that I learned that way, that was not a good way. Voting against the budget bill just got everybody irritated and meant that, but you know, it also, you know, some folks I went to and I said, okay, if you don't want me to do this, then help me learn how to convince all of you what we need to be doing financially. And that's a bit of what, you know, these, as my Maori friends would say, the pale scale guys are helping me with.
I don't mean,
sorry, that sounded disrespectful.
There are a number of great questions here, and I'm just trying to pick okay, I'm going to ask one that I think was asked by maybe one of the first-year students, but maybe not. Right now, a bunch of first years are learning the Aboriginal title, or they've already taken it in constitutional law or property law, and some of them, for the first time, are getting introduced to the idea of Indigenous law. So I'm going to combine this with another question. So this question talks about, is it time to incorporate more Indigenous law into the criminal justice system, how it works, the way that the criminal law works, and also there's a question about the parole system and how it acts as a merry-go-round in a certain respect for incarcerated persons, in particular Indigenous persons. I'm going to try and combine those two questions and see how you do.
Sure. I'll probably get an F, but that's all right. I heard people in the bathroom when I was coming in, getting ready. They had to file factums today, so hopefully everybody's, you know, doing okay on that. One of the things that I'm really excited, my daughter is in the Indigenous Law program at UVic, and that every time I talk to her, she says, "Mom, you're not taking the course." And I'm going, "Yeah, I wish I was." Because I think there's huge opportunity to, you know, Indigenous law isn't a monolith. You know, we have common law, but of course common law evolves in different jurisdictions according to who's involved. And similarly, Indigenous law is going to evolve in different ways, and it's different from what it was when contact happened to now because it's been suppressed. And it's going to be different here than it's going to be in BC or all over the place. But I do think, you know, I think the government saying that we're going to have a nation-to-nation relationship is a good first start. I don't think they have a clue, nor do I, exactly what that's going to look like. But I do think there's great opportunities. The example I used of sitting down with all the folks in Saskatchewan just recently, it was very clear. They have a clear understanding that, yes, you build an individualized approach, you build resources around people. In parole talk, in corrections talk, you would call that wraparound services. There they talk about providing the supports that person needs to succeed and to be part of the collective. I don't think we focus enough in common law and civil law and any of the other, because we already have a bijural, or whatever they call it, system in Canada with the civil law. But we're going to have to figure out how to work these together. And I actually am quite excited. I think if we can keep our grubby paws off of the provide resources and supports and not get interfering all the time, I think we could see some amazing things. If I had the power to just provide some of the resources that are even a quarter of what's being expended right now to jail Indigenous people in Saskatchewan and allocate it to the groups that I met with, we'd be all blown away by, how well people would do. One of the women, the one that I talked about, who had the baton brought up between her legs and is now out, during the pandemic, one of the really great things that happened is that a whole bunch of people got released to their homes who otherwise would have had to go to halfway houses. And don't hear me saying halfway houses aren't good. Of course, halfway houses are there for a reason. But the model of halfway house was developed around the way men lived post-World War II. And so when you know that it's a more paternalistic model. It's a model that involves rules. It involves, house mother type of things, or at least, someone cooking and providing. And I think we have to move past that. Lots of places have developed apartments and other styles, but we also have to recognize that halfway houses were brought in for situations where people didn't have homes to go to as well when they were getting out of prison. And during the pandemic, partly because a number of Indigenous women that I was working with got to go home, and they would not have got to go home. The one that I was talking about, they were trying to put her into a locked forensic unit or a locked dementia ward. They claimed she had dementia. They had changed her medication just before she got out. And because of the way they had classified her for 30-some years, because of the way they had kept her in segregation for most of that time, nobody in the community wanted her. No halfway house wanted her. No mental health resource wanted her. Nobody wanted her. The only person who was unconditionally clear she wanted her was her sister. She said, I want her to come and live with me. And what I didn't know until that moment was when she got her residential school, she was 11 years in residential school. You'll read summaries of the women in the report if you're interested. When she got a residential school settlement, she sent the money out so that her nieces could go to university. Because she said, we never got a chance to. We were all in residential school. Most of us ended up in prison then. And I want them to have a chance. And so she sent the money out. Those two nieces, one of them quit her job with the government so that she could provide support and is now doing child welfare work. And they set up a home environment for her. Corrections opposed it, and we kept pushing. And eventually, they knew they were looking ridiculous because and it was the parole board members, actually, some new parole board members who said, let's do it conditionally. Let her go to her home. It's called day parole other location, which means other than the halfway house. And so she went there, and 6 weeks later, her parole officer, who had opposed it, came on side and said, I can't believe it. I've never seen her smile so much. I just saw her last week, and she's constantly with a smile, except she says when she hasn't brushed her teeth and she doesn't want me to take a picture, but just joking aside. That environmental shift alone meant everybody who had dealt with her suddenly changed their opinion. Nobody thought she had dementia anymore. Nobody thought she was, excuse my language, but I guess we take it, nobody knows say it, out of her mind. Everybody suddenly realized, including some of the most hardened folks I dealt with in the prison system, said, we just changed her environment and put her in a home where she's loved and cared about. They had no professional, aside from the two nieces, they had no professional training, but what she had was a home and where she belonged and her own space. And she still, every day, the day that I visited her, her parole officer was visiting the next day, and she said, I'm terrified. And I said, why are you afraid? She said, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. I said, of course you're not doing anything wrong. She goes, but, you know, she's serving a life sentence until we get this conviction review. And so every day of her life is a risk that they'll yank her back to jail. And that's what she lives with, even with being in a supportive environment. Sorry, that was all very, you don't want to ask me any more questions, just want to shut up.
I do. Can I ask one more? I think we've got time for one more. So there's a question here about how, you know, what can individuals do to help make real change? And I want to combine that with another question, my question. So I teach different areas. One of them is family law. And something that I start my family law course is talking about the fact that in criminal law, to a certain extent, don't know how good it is, you are guaranteed legal representation if you're facing incarceration. Family law, you're not. And there's been several challenges that have all failed. And the problem is that the vast majority of people charged with crimes are men, and the vast majority of people who can't afford legal representation in family law matters are women. And so what I'm hoping, what I try and sort of beat into the heads of my students is, it's not just criminal law, it's not just constitutional law, it's all areas of the law that you can use if you want to help marginalized people or underprivileged people. So I wondered if you could talk about some of the things that these students can do now while in law school, and if they choose to practice corporate law or business law or family law, how they can still be part of this project.
Mm-hmm. Well, most of us start doing volunteer work. I mean, that's how I started in all of the work that I'm doing. It was, you know, I started out by saying I have the privilege of getting to do and get paid now, and paid really well, and in this incredible position, to do the things that were really my passion. So if you care about something, if it's the thing that really gets you wanting to go out and whether it's go to class or go to do a volunteer job or to whatever it is, study, that's the area obviously you're interested in, and try not to fight it too much. I mean, it's, you know, I probably wasn't the best example when I was, you know, working and had red circled my salary and couldn't afford a car and, you know, all those things. But I was never unhappy in the work I was doing. It was, there was always some of that. So I think everybody has to decide for themselves, but for sure, we need folks who are interested in these issues. I'd say if you're doing corporate, I mean, I went to law school to make money. I wasn't planning to do what I'm doing, what I ended up doing. I was a working class kid, and I was like, oh, you know, well, you know, it looks like I'm going to have to support a bunch of people here. I better get my act together. And, you know, as you heard, I'm sorry, I shouldn't joke. I'm in an incredibly privileged position now. But you know, I think those who have gone into those areas, I often say to my old buddies, I used to say that anybody I went to law school with probably didn't like it when they saw me coming, because I was usually trying to get them to do a freebie and represent someone, or I was trying to get them to donate to, like, pay someone's rent, or, you know, get a lawyer or do something. And there's law firms are doing incredible things now. I mean, I just think of Vince Calderhead, who's, you know, in a public interest position now, and that's the work he does, and it's funded by a law firm, and it's underwritten by all of the other folks who are, you know, making the bigger bucks in other areas. And that's who I'm consulting, for instance, about how do we make the disability benefit adequate, as we're having the debates coming up, because he's an expert in that area. And I think there's lots of areas you can work, even if you can't. And I totally respect people have responsibilities and issues they have to take care of. If you know information, make sure if you can't do anything with it, someone gets it. And I mentioned a little bit ago that I get a lot of information from people inside. And, you know, lots of times people will say, you didn't hear it from me, but X, Y, or Z. And I, you know, that's years of people knowing I'll protect their confidentiality. That, you know, if they tell me, I know they want something done with it. Because if you tell me something and say, don't do anything about it, too late, sucks to be you. You've already told me, I'm doing something about it. And the reality is, people don't tell you if they really don't want you to do something about it, in my experience. And, you know, it could be, if I'm wrong at some point, I apologize profusely to everybody, but thus far, even things that are really uncomfortable that you find out, usually it's because people want you to do something about it. And so There's lots of people in corrections who would never go forward with something because they want to keep their job, their benefits, they're single moms, whatever reason. I try not to judge that. But, you know, I say, if you have the information and you don't give it to someone who can do something with or share it with someone, then it's on you. And so I think that's really important as well, that we keep making sure that people know the information. It's why, you know, we get, every day in the office, there's at least 4 or 5 pieces of course, like physical correspondence. Then we get all the emails from family members and lawyers. And it's probably 50 to 20 contacts a day from people inside. Half the time it's them copying me on things because I'm really clear in saying I can't pick up every single case. It would be impossible. I would do nothing else. And I really do want to try and get some of that longer term. But if you copy me on it and they know I'm watching it, at the very least there may be some greater accountability. And if you copy me on it and I see something that you may not even recognize as a significant breach in every other way, then sometimes I'll write back and say, you know, I suggest you contact this lawyer or whoever. And so I don't know if that really answers your question. But.
It's pretty good. We are out of time, so the dean is going to come back up here, and some other people are too. But while I have the chance, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.